everybody, and welcome to Getting APIs to Work. In today's episode, we say hello to Matthew Reinbold, who is Director of the API Center for Excellence at Capital One. Hey, Matthew, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you, Eric?
I'm doing well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our little chat. So what we want to talk about is REST and GraphQL a little bit, but mostly also API governance and how do those things come together. And when it comes to governance, I love the definition that you gave me, saying that governance is a process to facilitate change. It's a great definition, but I think if you ask a lot of people what governance is, that's not exactly the way they would frame it. So explain me a little bit how you got to that mindset.
Right. Like many people, when I first thought of governance in relation to APIs, I thought about rules and I thought about enforcement and I thought about heavy bureaucratic processes. And through my time running the API Center of Excellence, I've always sought out different approaches or how to reframe that approach. Because obviously, the way that we relate to each other in an organization can be a positive experience or it can be a negative experience. So how can we take this structure that we have, in this case, the Center of Excellence, and this thing called API governance, and accentuate the benefits for the people involved, as opposed to being your stereotypical top-down ivory tower architecture? So it's been a long process. I would love to say that I've completely nailed it, but it's something that I'm constantly finding new wrinkles and new expressions and new reframings of our role and our work. And so it's the kind of thing where it's never done because, frankly, the relationships and the work that we're doing is never quite done.
I really like that way of looking at it. So what you're saying is that in the end, mostly your job is to make sure that people work together in a productive way, I think. And
yeah,
let's briefly look at your, and I also loved your profile that I grabbed from LinkedIn that said, you're a platform thinker, a digital transformer, designer, people manager, right? So all these skills actually are very, very important, not just enforcing rules, but understanding why you do it and what may be the upsides and the downsides of certain decisions. And as one part of that, and I think that is actually one of the things that how I got to know you initially, is you're following the API space very closely. You're very well known in the API space. I think pretty much everybody who's watching this video, I hope so, is subscribing to your Net API notes. For how long have you been doing those Net API notes?
Since 2015. So recently you passed the 5-year mark, and it started as my own self-education, looking out at the industry, trying to distill the volumes of new stuff that came out week in, week out, to just like the really salient, great bits. And over time, it turned out like, well, wait a minute, I'm doing this for myself, but other people could probably benefit. So why don't I share my notes out with the larger world? And it's been incredibly gratifying, because if I make a mistake, if I put something out there that isn't quite correct, I have a community that feeds back and helps correct me and helps course correct. Likewise, if I nail something that really resonates with the audience and that moves them somehow, which is kind of a strange thing to say about a technical subject, but it happens. If I hit upon something that really resonates with the audience, that's great feedback for me as well. So it's a labor of love that has certainly been very beneficial for my professional career.
I hope so. It definitely has been beneficial for everybody subscribing to it. So keep it up. It's really, I think it's strictly on a weekly basis, right?
Several times a month. There are weeks like this week where I get busy, stuff's going on,
yeah.
or I make this a point. Like sometimes there's just not enough stuff to present. And rather than trying to drum up some kind of false controversy or something that isn't quite up to my expectations, I just don't publish that month. So anybody that subscribes can be reasonably assured that if they're getting something in their inbox, it's going to be worth their time.
Yes, and that's definitely the case, I think. And you gave me a very good lead in here by talking about drumming up a false controversy. Not that it's a false one, but it's definitely one that has been very, I think, very visible over the last few years by now, right? Is that like REST versus GraphQL thing? And let's not even discuss what it is or it is not. I've done a couple of pieces, you've done a couple of pieces, right? So there's that. But then the interesting part to me is to really think about how does that affect now how APIs are being designed and used in large organizations, because that is a trigger from the outside where somebody at least claims, here's a new way to do APIs, it's much better in certain ways. Now, what happens, right? And I really found it interesting to talk to you in terms of like, how does that relate to this governance process, right? Where the governance process, on the one hand, does have some, let's say, conservative aspects to it. On the other hand, it also has aspects to it, how it helps with change, right? So how did you first encounter GraphQL in Capital One? Like, what were the first signs internally that people picked up on that?
Yeah. Let me back up and provide a little bit of context about governance and what we're trying to accomplish, and then I'll feed in with how GraphQL impacted that. So if you go outside of your house, or if I went outside of my house and I decided that I was going to drive down the road, there's certain constraints that I have to abide by, whether that's being on a certain side of the road to allow opposing traffic to get by, or following a speed limit, or using my turn signal. There's a variety of constraints that we use when we're traveling in this shared space. Companies are like that shared space. And from the developer's perspective, or from the development team's perspective, it can be very desirable to just go as fast as possible, ignore all of those constraints, and arrive at that destination with the fewest amount of limitations. I get that. That's the perspective. But from an API governance perspective, we have to oversee more than one team trying to travel that same road. In the same way, the reason that traffic limitations exist is because they're trying to maximize the most number of people traveling to the greatest number of destinations safely. Our governance group tries to make sure that we have the proper constraints that allow people to go to the most number of places, get the most number of things done safely, securely, scalably, reliably, all of those ilities that oftentimes come into place when you're talking about software architecture. So from that perspective, our program started thinking about this more holistic capability, not just one API in isolation, but how does this API relate to the needs of the organization? How does this API relate not just at this moment in time that we're developing it, but for the developers 5 years from now, the developers 10 years from now? And so that framework imposes some constraints. And when we started, it was almost entirely REST-ish. I'm not going to say full-on REST because that carries a certain set of connotations, but REST-ish. And as a result, those conventions or those constraints existed. People operated within those constraints, and that ecosystem ended up producing things like SDKs and libraries and default error standards and so on and so forth. Like, people built upon that ecosystem because it was stable and it was well known. And then GraphQL came along. And like many new things in the industry, we had some people poking on it and prodding on it. And we started hearing people asking, like, okay, this is really interesting. It's perhaps the best way to solve my use case. How does this work? And so then it became a matter of, okay, let's go back to our governance principles. And when I say principles, I mean not just like the standards, the thou shall and the thou shall not. I also am referring to our principles of how we engage with each other. Have we created the forum that people can submit new ideas to, where they can raise their hand and say, hey, I've got an idea. I've got something different. I've got something outside of the box that you've drawn. This is how I let you know that there's something alternative. And then this is our well-established process for taking that idea, that question that you had, and for evaluating it. This is the well-understood process whereby we have a community of leaders across the company, not just us, but how we engage with that idea, how we ratify it, how we talk about it, how we figure out where are the places where it makes sense and where it doesn't. So governance is not something that is foisted upon people. It's not something that is a burden that they have to adhere to, but rather it's the co-owned process by which we are looking at those ideas. Some of the ideas that are submitted to us, like, hey, I think I should do RPC all the time. We've got some issues with that. Let's talk about what you're actually trying to accomplish. What's behind that statement? Likewise, when we did that collaboration, when we did that discussion, going through those processes, like, for sure, some of that desire and that sentiment for GraphQL turned out to be what we often refer to as resume-driven development. It was a hot topic, and people wanted that bullet point on their resume.
Yes.
But that said, there were other people that came forward, and as we went through that process, we were able to look at it and go, oh, yeah, that is an interesting use case, and you are absolutely right. This is something that GraphQL uniquely solves in a way that's better, faster, fitter, whatever the reason is. And we were able to say, okay, now let's go on to the next step.
So what were those use cases when you were looking at them? Like you said, right? Like sometimes people just see something new and want to try it out, which is understandable at that point. But then the other question is, okay, and now once you actually reach the point where you say, yeah, no, that actually makes sense. Like, how would you characterize those usages where you said, yeah, that's at least a reasonable request to be able to do that?
Right. So they vary quite a bit. One particular case was a situation where there were hundreds of fields. I'm wondering how much I should get into it. But bottom line, if you were to define this in an open API description, it would be gigantic. And the use case, the consumption case, was that you'd never call this thing and get megabytes in your payload all at once. You'd actually probably call for specific chunks or specific subsets. And there was a reason why we couldn't just model those as separate resources. It was also dynamic, and it was also a new area where creating an explicit relationship or explicit resource objects was somewhat tenuous. And I'll end with the consumer and the producer were very closely intertwined. The distance between the producer and the consumer was not that great. So when it came to comprehension overhead, if something didn't make sense, the consumer was working alongside the producer in the same team. And so it was like, okay, well, having explicit relationships, trying to minimize comprehension overhead, it's not that big a deal here because the calls are coming from inside the house.
I mean, you're pretty much describing the Facebook use case, right? That's pretty much what it was invented for, so to speak. So unsurprisingly, that was probably a good fit.
Yeah, there's absolutely a reason why the Facebook mobile client talks to the Facebook backend, but they haven't released a GraphQL API for external people. It goes back to that comprehension piece where if you're within Facebook and you have a rapidly changing UI because they're constantly trying new stuff out, it's advantageous to allow those UI developers to just call what they need. But as soon as you go outside of the house, as soon as you cross that barrier and you are an external third party, you don't want to expose a query language where anybody anywhere can get stuff, because then you end up with a Cambridge Analytica situation.
Well, that plus it kind of gets tricky when you say, hey, and by the way, our schema changes twice a day. Good luck with keeping up with it, right? So,
Right.
yeah. Okay, so yeah, so I think and that's probably a situation that I think a lot of people will find themselves in, that when they look at that, there's definitely some use cases where it does make sense. And now let's look at the next step and see that, okay, now that you're kind of in that evaluation phase and say, okay, sounds like this is a legitimate use case. Now, what do we do? So what happened then?
So then it became a matter of, how do we introduce this piece into our broader ecosystem? There are things where, when introduced into your ecosystem, they become like an invasive species, where, oh my gosh, I put this thing in thinking that it was going to be nice and in the corner, and then all of a sudden I wake up the next morning and there's dandelions across my entire front yard. What happened? And that's in particular the way we look at RPC. And to be clear, not gRPC, but just RPC, where there's no affordance being shared in the resource naming, where it's just whatever the developer had to happen to come up with, and it's very similar to maybe how they're naming their class calls or their method calls. Like, we push back on that and say, listen, there's actually conventions when it comes to resource-based design where you can leverage your prior experience. You look at that name, you know it's probably a collection. If you post to it, you can create a new instance, and your instance will be named this way at this path. Like, there's certain affordances that make themselves readily available if you're following a naming convention. With RPC, that goes out the window. That's one of those invasive species where, if just allowed to propagate, the comprehension of your entire ecosystem goes steadily down as more and more people just introduce their fragmented approach to naming things.
Yeah.
When it comes to GraphQL, it's like, okay, we see what this is. We know what we're trying to accomplish as a program. We're trying to maintain this set of conventions or set of constraints that allow people to work safely alongside each other. So let's define the constraints. For example, we're not going to expose a GraphQL API outside of our company boundaries. We're not going to expose one to our partners or third parties. That's something that again, going through our process and ratifying, we said we feel pretty strongly that that's the correct approach. And then we also, as part of governance, communicate that out and ask for feedback back. You know, it's the communication of all of these things is a opportunity for a virtuous cycle to happen, where there might not have been people in the room when the decision was made, but there's probably people that have something to say about it. So making sure that your communication processes are effective is just as important as the processes whereby you're getting signals and using those to true up your program.
That part I really like. Have you looked at the Google API improvement proposals, kind of their way of managing their guidelines?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what I really liked about that, apart from any details, right? But that I think actually the first chapter, so to speak, that they have is it talks about how these things are getting changed, right? So, and there is a process, and there's a way how you collaborate with it. So very, very early on, right? When you look at it, you understand that, oh, and if I don't like any of this, or, you know, I want to make changes here, I can do it. And I think that just, like you said, it just sets the tone that already is very different from reading a document that who knows where it came from and how I can change it, right? That seems very impenetrable to me. And that spirit, I think, is really nice.
Yeah, making that process transparent is so empowering for developers. I will tell any company they already have a governance process, but whether that's explicit or implicit, it remains to be seen. Like, if your process for allowing something new, like a GraphQL, to take root, if that is, well, go talk to Barry because Barry runs the cloud provisioning, and he'll be the one to get you the
But don't go on a Monday. Barry is in a bad mood on Mondays.
Exactly. But so that's what I'm saying. Like, that's an informal governance process. Like, there are controls there, but they're unstated, and it has to be who you know to get stuff done. Like, you gotta bring in donuts that morning and catch him at the right moment, and then you can do your thing. That's a really crappy governance experience. So much better to do like what Google did, make it explicit, and even go the one step further, which I will admit is something that we haven't done. Make it public, so then the wider world can read it and look at it and comment. And that's a whole nother level that I still aspire to.
Yeah, and it's not actually, in the case of Google, it's really not that complicated, which also is good, right? It shouldn't be, even if it is documented, right? It shouldn't feel like, well, now I know how it works, but I'll never make it through it because it's such a complex process. So in that case, it's a pretty simple one. It's basically like a simple flow chart.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and there's no Barry in it.
Yes.
It's all well-defined steps. So that's good. So yeah, so I find these, the kind of this kind of management really fascinating, because it also it just mirrors so many things in real life in our society. Like your example with the cars, right? It's the same kind of thing. Only because somebody gets a new car doesn't mean they can drive around like a madman. And I think it's the exact same thing. So what I'm wondering about is looking at that decision process and the decision that you made now. How would you say, how did that go down with the community? Did you feel like some people were really upset, right? Because that is also what happens in real life. Like, some sub-communities, so to speak, get just upset by certain decisions because it's not good for them, which just may be true, right? So how did that go?
This is where having empathy for the stakeholders or the users, and being able to have experience in a service role, not a technical API service, but actual like service industry, like dealing with people, talking with people, communicating with people, becomes incredibly important. You can have a very sound, technically defensible position, but if you are just rubbing it in people's face, no, I think that's a stupid idea, you are going to get pushback. That doesn't feel good. So going and talking with people, making sure that they feel listened to, creating the psychological safety so that if there's a problem, if they don't agree with something, they feel safe in being able to tell you and relate it to you. And then being able to convey to them why maybe this isn't right now. Maybe there's preconditions that if we can just figure these things out, we can take the next step. It's no for now, but we meet these things, acknowledging change, keeping the door open. It goes a long way. And at the end of the day, it's very important that you're not burning bridges. As nice as it might feel to really like stick it to somebody, to really like have the great point and like really like, I'm gonna take my experience and I'm just gonna shove it to you. We again, governance is how we relate to each other at the 50,000 foot view, how we relate to each other. We are going to see these people again. We are going to have to work with these people again. And as much in the moment, it might feel validating for us to really get that good point in and suck it to them. That's not how you build an ecosystem that's going to thrive.
I like that. It's definitely not something we should discuss any further, but it reminds me a lot, of all these discussions of the current political climate in certain countries, right, where this divisiveness, right, like at some point it becomes so hard to do anything together, and it becomes so hard to get together again, right, and start working on actual issues. So I think it's really, really important to keep in mind what you just said, right? Like these decisions are being made and there are certain reasons for it, communicate the reasons, and then, move forward. And I really like that mindset. A very minor question, because I don't think it's a super important discussion, but there is kind of this discussion between, are you a center for enablement or a center for enablement or a center for excellence or something like this? Like, I know that you're on the excellence path. Have you ever thought about this even?
Yes, and that's been a big question. I think Mark O'Neill from Gartner was really popularizing the Center of Enablement about the same time that we adopted our moniker, Center of Excellence. In our particular case, it was because Center of Excellences as a concept was known to our executive leadership team.
Okay.
They knew what it was. It was a way of bypassing a lot of the explanation that needs to happen. They had it for a variety of different things, whether it's DevOps or Agile or whatever. So by saying API Center of Excellence, we can immediately jump to the next step, which is how we get funded, as opposed to having to explain this concept of, well, what do you mean by enablement?
That's a good point. Actually, I think in most of the organizations where I have seen this naming, it was the exact same thing that you mentioned, where they already had that as a model of an entity in the organization, and then you just took that kind of naming pattern and just created a new one.
Yeah, I think in practice we're probably much closer to a center of enablement. But again, much like APIs, the language is so important, and it's also contextual. So, understanding the language that your organization speaks and making sure that you are fitting into that so that you can then break from it at the right moment. And, very, very important.
Yeah. One last thing that I'm interested in. So you talked about, the communicating the decisions, making sure that you are clear and emphatic when you do that, which I think is really a great point. What I'm wondering is, when you were explaining those and said, basically, for these reasons, we're not doing that right now, but if these conditions change, we will reconsider. What were the most important things that you were looking at and said, for these reasons right now, it really doesn't feel like a decision we should take?
Right. When it came to GraphQL, it was so much around the way that the processing occurs. So for those familiar with GraphQL, you'll know that your entirety of the query is handled through a post action. And as such, in order to understand what data is flowing in and out of the company through a GraphQL API, we would have to do packet introspection on the actual body contents. For a publicly regulated institution that deals with people's money and some sensitive data, that was a concern. We want to make sure that our APIs are fast and that they're efficient, and that we also have the proper security controls on them. And the way that has typically happened with API REST-ish interface is that we look at the endpoints and we secure by the type of endpoints. But doing a post for all things to a single endpoint, that requires some doing. So, we have things around entitlements and tokenization and field redaction and stuff like that. All things that maybe we can get to one day, but just on the surface, it was a concern with exposing that publicly.
Yeah, I guess there are many things that you can just kind of list on the technical level, right? And so, yeah, these are all solvable problems, but until we've solved them, it's something we need to keep in mind before we just jump onto that. So,
well, and it provides clarity for the team, because now they have that checklist of things. Like, if you can show that you're doing A and B and C and D, you should be good to go, as opposed to, they turned it down some point in the past. I don't understand what I need to do with this. Providing clarity and the communication so that people know exactly what their next steps need to be if they want to continue down this road is incredibly important.
Great. Matthew, thank you so much. I think this was a really good story. I like these kind of, it's like not just talking about governance in the abstract, but taking one case and talking through it and looking at what matters and also what makes it workable for the organization and what really creates that environment where change can happen, right? But there's certain guardrails within which that is going to happen.
Great.
Thanks so much. Is there any last words you would like to add?
Well, first off, thanks for the opportunity. This has been fun. If people want to continue the discussion, I'm certainly very active on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter, but probably more importantly, you can look up my website, which is very imaginatively named MatthewReinbold.com. You can look in the show notes for how to spell my name. If you go to MatthewReinbold.com, you'll find not only the Twitter handle, but you'll also find the link to Net API notes so you can subscribe. And again, if you've got comments or feedback, I am very interested in hearing from you. I don't think one person or even one organization has completely got this licked. And it's also something that is going to be increasingly important going forward as we get more and more APIs within organizations. How those organizations manage things is going to be incredibly important. So I'd love to discuss this and keep the conversation going with other people doing similar things in other companies.
Thanks. These were perfect closing words, I think. So yes, everybody please subscribe to Matthew's Net API notes. These are really great and keep you up to date. Thanks everybody for watching. If you like this, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any comments, please leave a comment down below or interact with Matthew on Twitter. Yeah. So thanks a lot. Thanks for being on the show and hope to see you soon. Bye.